using contemporary language, both von Hildebrand and the contemporary Aristotelian tradition, mainly in its Thomistic form, but also in other varieties, they both share, with respect to moral philosophy, a non-reductive, a non-naturalistic foundation to morality, and that's a joint project seen from a certain perspective that already seems to portend all kinds of convergence. Of course, they get to their foundations through different routes. And what I wanted to suggest above all else is that the route by means of which Aristotle and the Aristotelian tradition that precedes seeks to articulate from a metaphysical position the defense of those principles of human action is, I think, richer than what von Hildebrand points to in one respect, and that is to say that it's driven by a systematic inquiry into how everything fits together. And von Hildebrand is less concerned with that question, and so we don't find that inquiry, and at least not in any kind of systematic fashion. So some of the language that's used to describe certain phenomena differs quite a bit, but I think as we peel back the layers of the account of value, other aspects of the categories of importance, we found there to be some deeper convergences there. And I think even with respect to the way in which the categories of importance emerge and make themselves evident to a knower, you find a relational connection between the subject and the objects of reflection. And that relational epistemological connection points as well to metaphysical connections. So we reached a point yesterday in our discussion on the good that I think for a while it was looking as though there was nothing in common in the approaches, and then we came back to see that no, there are these lines of convergence. So I would invite each of us to continue to poke around at those lines of convergence, not to reduce von Hildebrand into the tradition. Let him continue to speak in his own voice, but ultimately I think he needs a tradition if he's going to have staying power. So I think each of us have seen glimpses of what makes his approach so attractive, but von Hildebrand is insufficient unto himself to represent a tradition of thought. He needs to be incorporated into a tradition, and the way to do that, I think, is through developing the metaphysical connections. At least that's my own natural inclination in terms of how to unite them. So I was trying to think of another image to capture the way in general I think of some of the differences between the two, and one that comes to mind is the difference between looking at photographs, stills, versus a moving picture, where von Hildebrand is a master of studying the stills, and almost as though, now to make this a science fiction-esque example, you touch the photograph and it comes to life, so to speak, like a hologram. The details emerge, and you can touch different parts of the photograph, and as you do that, a new detail emerges, and it seems more than it is, because in fact it's a window that opens up onto the reality of the thing. But you don't see this. Let's say you're in a room of these still photographs. You don't see them all together unless you reflect upon actuality and the perfected act, and the lines of actuality that emerge through a systematic Thomistic metaphysics allows you to take in all of the photographs at once. But what happens when you do that, of course, is the details are sometimes lost, right? So we really need the complementarity of the virtue of looking at those details and appreciating them for what they are, and then seeing how they all fit together. It's a very rough-hewn example of the way in which I see some of the differences between these two thinkers, or one a tradition, the other a unique thinker in his own right. But I hope that's at least helpful. So. Von Hildebrand is careful to affirm that a value is in that thing. It's not in relation in one sense. It is in relation in some other senses we've explored. But you recognize that it is what it is, but you recognize it. And in recognizing that it is what it is, you've nevertheless somehow assimilated it into your mind, right? So the language of the Aristotelian tradition is more explicit on this, right? Where you actually become what you know, but in a modified way. But there's a place for that, I think, within von Hildebrand's thought, and it's what allows one to know a valuable being or the value of a being without doing violence to that being, right? I mean, you don't rip the value out. So we can talk about this in terms of the language of transcendence. There's a kind of going out, but I think it's a going out only because it's come in. You've been confronted by the value. It's got a certain datum of experience, and you recognize it as such. So there's got to be some kind of translation on the part of the knower, where you have the capacity to recognize this thing, to translate it into the modes by means of which you can understand it without doing violence to the thing itself, and at the same time recognize that the thing is there. So it makes a difference then what you are attuned to. We could talk about attunement here. We could look at your affections, your passions, what you're preoccupied with, and some of the other examples. And this relates to value blindness. I wasn't here for that part of the discussion. I mean, there's complete value blindness, but there are shades in between. And what constitutes those shades in between is the character of the subject. And to use Aristotelian language, I mean, what sort of character does this person have, and what collection of habits constitute them? Because it's by means of the habits that we're receptive to things in the world, right? They're a kind of standing ready to perceive the world in a certain way and respond in another. And so that's another area. You know, what you remember, what you know, what you've heard about this thing, and also who you are as a person in terms of your qualitative values, to use von Hildebrand's language. So I think all of that could be worked up quite a bit more. And one thing that I will say I've never quite been able to capture when I've worked through von Hildebrand on these points is how exactly that, what I've used the term translation to describe, how exactly that process occurs. So you were talking about sense datum, right? Is it just the sense datum of the thing and we absorb that? Well, what does that mean? What are we stripping away? When we see something, and then I could take you through the Aristotelian Thomistic description of sense perception, moving into the common senses, moving into imagination and memory and cognitive, your cognitive power, and then you've got the phantasm, and you abstract from the phantasm. And so if you're familiar with how that works, that's how the object becomes you, how you become the object. How exactly does that happen in von Hildebrand, right? He affirms that it happens, he points out ways in which it does happen, but what is the process by means of which we're able to perform this kind of act? I don't know if you want to provide some help on that, but I've never quite been able to understand how it is that we reduce valuable objects to our own intellectual receptive capacity. So he gives wonderful examples showing how we do that and makes distinctions there.
Yes.
But how exactly does that happen?
Yeah, it is true that there are different the different metaphors that can be employed here with cognition in general and value cognition in particular. And he does favor the metaphor of a certain self-transcendence, a kind of ecstatic structure of perception and knowledge, and also of value perception, that one somehow surpasses oneself and enters into something other than oneself, and that capturing that otherness is the great self-transcending achievement in his view. Now the other metaphor is, as Sartre says in a famous essay, the metaphor of digestion, whereby the thing cognized is somehow taken into and absorbed into my cognitive system. And when Sartre makes that point, he says this is the very opposite of phenomenological intentionality. The whole idea of intentionality involves this outward thrust, this ecstatic being outside of oneself in the thing known. So Van Hildebrand certainly consistently uses that notion of self-transcendence, surpassing, in a sense, one's subjectivity and encountering something really other than oneself in its otherness. I think his position is this: there are values that are proper, let's say, to a Christian saint, like St. Francis of Assisi, who made an enormous impression on Van Hildebrand before he was even Catholic, and he named his son Franz for St. Francis of Assisi. Now, Van Hildebrand thinks that there is a holiness there, a meekness, a self-emptying love, unlike anything that a Socrates could have dreamt of. There's something specifically Christian. And his view was that there's, in a St. Francis of Assisi, there's something that breaks into our experience, that somebody not sharing the faith of St. Francis can see a new kind of unearthly light shining in such a saint. So he says at the same time, if you don't share the faith of St. Francis, you're not in a position to live that life. And so there's a faith basis for that radical Christian existence. But it breaks into the immediate experience of every open human being, believer or not. And in fact, I think it's true to say nothing was so instrumental in Van Hildebrand's own conversion as this discovery of a kind of supernatural glory in the saints that he could first of all experience, and then by tracking that down to its source, he was brought to the threshold of conversion. So there is such a thing as, you could say, grace-based value, but he would at the same time want to say there are also many values that are natural, that, like the dignity of a person, the excellence of justice, the nobility of a Socrates, these he would not want to say are grace-based or faith-based like the holiness of a saint. See, so to say that the whole value theory is a matter of grace, that he would shrink away from. And but there is a sense in which he's a very unusual phenomenologist, in that the given for him is not just limited to what any pagan can live, but the given includes the Christian given, as in a saint. He used to quote with great approval this a line from Bergson, who said that there's something in the Christian saints unlike any other good and worthy people, a new kind of splendor. And Hildebrand said, you see, even Bergson, though he was not a Christian, saw that and explored it in his own philosophy of religion. Humility, he thought, was a specifically Christian virtue. He thought that it takes the encounter with the living God of Christian revelation to be humble. And therefore he thinks that Plato or Socrates can't be humble in the Christian sense. Not because there's some moral fault in them, but because they don't have the view of God in the world which makes sense of humility. But he thinks that a non-believer can see a certain unearthly beauty in the humility of a saint. And so the phenomenologically given does include specifically Christian excellences. You know, he does think that there are value mistakes, value errors, value deceptions, value illusions. It can take all kinds of forms. Wishful thinking, you know, can make you imagine some value that's not really there, or a kind of disordered infatuation with a person can lead you to invest them with all kinds of value that they don't really have. So there is value deception, but the question is the situation here any different than deception in other areas, like with regard to substance? I can misperceive a given substance. I can misdescribe it, misunderstand it, think there's a substance where there is none. So that is the problem of error any different with value than with substance? The same is true of substance. It's something that stands in itself. It's not just a subject-dependent quality, and so I should be able to recognize it in itself. And yet we make a lot of errors in our judgments about the substance world, just like we make errors with regard to value. The general principle for purifying our minds and hearts of value error for von Hildebrand is this growth in reverence. He thinks that subjection of oneself to value and this taking delight in this order of and world of value, that reverence more than anything disabuses us of self-deception and enables us to see what really has worth.